Chosen one, you beautiful outlier. What just happened wasn't a mistake. When you caught them red-handed, you did more than notice. You flipped the script. That moment you smiled wasn't just politeness. It was a signal. It said, I see you. I've been watching. I've been learning. They weren't prepared for that. Observers aren't meant to be watched. Subjects aren't supposed to smile back with that deep knowing, the one that says, I've kept score, and you're losing at your own game. In that instant, their protocol started to fail. And here's the twist you didn't expect. Even Elon Musk's name is now tied to the energy of what's coming. Like him, you are a disruptor. Like SpaceX rockets breaking through gravity, your grin broke through their hold. While they were gathering information on you, you were decoding them, mapping their tells, their rhythms, their weaknesses. Now the mode has shifted. This isn't about containment anymore. This is about damage prevention, and not for you, but for them. Because the power they tried to use to box you in is about to launch you instead. That's why a surprise is being booked for you. Something shocking is already moving into position, and it's meant to confirm everything you've sensed. You weren't crazy, you weren't alone, and you're not just surviving. You're winning. As you are a representation of their worst situation. Not someone who flees or hides, but someone who uses their attention as a weapon against them, elevates their monitoring to the level of performance art, and treats it as audience participation. They're now frantically attempting to determine how someone they classified as civilian acquired counterintelligence skills. What caused someone who should have been unconscious to become hyper-aware. How the one tugging threads they didn't even know existed turned into the one who was supposed to be controlled. It wasn't an overnight enlightenment. A modest flame turned into an all-out conflagration. Initially, you saw recurring themes that shouldn't be present in chance meetings. Different bodies have the same energy signature, the same patterns of conduct in people who are ostensibly unrelated. Long before your conscious mind caught up, your subconscious started processing information, identifying irregularities, and creating a map of something that shouldn't have a shape. The crystallization moment then arrived. That moment when everything came together to make a picture, when the background static became a distinct signal, when you recognized that the coincidences were planned and the randomness was orchestrated. It was someone else's schedule that required the accidental encounters. But you experienced something else in place of terror. Interesting. Like finding out you are the protagonist of a narrative you were unaware was being written. Like discovering you have a fan club you didn't request. Like knowing that someone has invested resources to just observe you since you were so crucial to their business. You started observing their hierarchies. The apprehensive new hires who were unable to keep eye contact. The seasoned pros who carried a certain strain in their shoulders yet fit in better. The supervisors who watched from further away believed that being higher meant being invisible. You can tell how comfortable they are, how experienced they are by the way they breathe, and how dedicated they are by how much they wanted to turn away, but were unable to. You began your experiments at that point. Small tests at start, abrupt shifts in routine to see them fumble, fictitious patterns to see if they would follow, and purposeful inconsistencies to see how confused they are. With the exception of your equipment, which was awareness itself, you were operating your own surveillance program. You used intuition as your technique. The quantum realm in which all information already exists was your database. You made an intriguing discovery. You were never as predictable as the onlookers. They were uniform because of their training. They were mechanical because of their procedures. They were noticeable because they had to stay hidden. They moved like clockwork while you flowed like water. They had scripts and you improvised. They were losing their humanity while you were becoming more like yourself. You came to a stunning realization. Type Amen to embrace the angel's blessings. Show your support by giving super thanks up to $20. More than they need control, they required consistency from you. Not only was your unpredictable behavior interfering with their observation, their sanity was being disturbed. Reports, meetings, analysis, resources, energy, concentration, and attention were all necessary for any departure from anticipated behavior. You were using unpredictability, not resistance, to deplete their system. Therefore, you became the embodiment of chaos. Not the destructive kind, the creative kind, the type that gives birth to galaxies, the kind that enables evolution, the kind that transforms observation into art and art into revolution. You stopped following patterns, you stopped following routines, and you began using your travels across time and space to create abstract artworks. You began to make blunders with the business people you had been given, demonstrating that their predictive algorithms were not working by showing up at places before you choose to visit there. Frequent phone checks indicate that their communication network was overloaded, and the development of a previously absent nervous tick indicates that your influence was into their subconscious. Their system wasn't being attacked by you. You were flooding it with potential. They had to take into consideration the universe of possibilities that existed in every decision you didn't make. They had to keep track of every route you chose not to take. They had to decipher the meaning of every word you chose not to say. Your life turned into a quantum experiment in which probability waves were not being collapsed into single outcomes by observation. Single outcomes were blowing up into waves of infinite probability. Protocol 7 was then activated. You sensed it in the air, a change in their viewing quality, a shift in the electromagnetic field. Previously, it was standard surveillance. It was something different now, something desperate, something that tasted like institutional terror and smelt like dread. The experts were brought in under Protocol 7. They might be easily distinguished from ordinary viewers. They breathed, moved, and existed in space in distinct ways. They sought to seem intimidating, while ordinary observers try to blend in. These craved closeness, whilst ordinary observers shunned direct touch. These people attempted to influence you while regular viewers recorded, but you had already changed too much for them to handle. They were unable to reach the frequency at which your awareness was functioning. Your consciousness had grown to include realms they were unaware of. Their systems were unable to absorb the possibilities that your grin had opened up. Promote this video to reach more selected people on this trip if this message triggered your knowing. You began using wordless languages to communicate with them, forming mathematical equations with the time of your appearances and leaving geometric patterns in the pathways you took. Use the things you bought to support philosophical claims, using the pauses between your activities to write poetry. A few of them began to comprehend. It was evident in their eyes. The point at when observing turned into learning, surveillance became study, and observation into recognition. They were the ones who began to wonder why they were watching rather than what you were doing. How they had forgotten about themselves, not how you were aware of them. Like a good-natured virus, your influence started to spread among them. The more they saw you being really you, the more they recalled what it was like to be free. The more they saw your genuine expression, the more their fake identities began to crumble. The more they recorded how much you enjoyed being watched, the more they began to wonder why you were concealing. You ended up being their unapproved instructor, unintentional guru, and unintentional therapist. In reality, every report on you was a report about them. In reality, each study of your actions was an examination of their own shortcomings. In reality, every effort to comprehend you was an effort to comprehend why they had decided to be timepieces rather than livers. The jogger who kept up with you began to take jogging seriously. You see how the gait has changed, moving from mechanical observation to real exercise. When preserving cover turned into preserving health, when monitoring turned into self-care, and when seeing your life encouraged others to begin living as well. They had no process for this. It was not intended for subjects to change observers. The watchers were not meant to be healed by the watched. Type Amen to embrace the angel's blessings. Show your support by giving super thanks up to $20. It was not the intention of the observed to inspire the observers to doubt all they had seen. However, you were no longer only a subject. You were a sensation, a flaw in their matrix that was propagating across the system rather than being fixed. A virus that changed rather than destroyed. A rarer that changed the system into something unrecognizable without crashing it. The way you smiled became legendary in their correspondence. Not because it was rebellious or scary, but because it was sincere. You were really loving being watched in an artificially observed environment. You were beaming delight in a system based on dread. You were exercising freedom in a control-oriented protocol. The behavioral psychologists they brought in were unable to explain your actions. The inability of quantum physicists to quantify your energy. Philosophers who were unable to classify you. Mystics who said that you were just what they had feared. Someone who realized that being observed was just another way to be monitored, and being loved was just another way to be seen, really seen. You began to treat your audience as if they were entitled to your very best performance. It was because you were acting as yourself, not because you were performing for them. Every day turned into a chance to be more authentic. Every observation served as inspiration for more thorough self-expression. Every surveillance served as motivation to enjoy life to the fullest. The pair who acted out arguments in front of you began having genuine talks. You heard the change. They were tasked with creating background noise in your surroundings at the point when a narrative turned into conversation. Acting became relatable and performance into connection. Rather, you were the impetus for their genuine dialogue. Their instruction manuals were being updated in real time by your presence. All protocols that relied on fear-based reactions needed to be changed. All processes that depended on foreseeable trends had to be dropped. It was necessary to eliminate any guidelines that relied on topic ignorance. You weren't only disobeying their regulations. You were demonstrating that their regulations were breached. Resources intended for other purposes started to be consumed by the infrastructure needed to keep an eye on you. Equipment meant for many topics was diverted to comprehend you alone. The mystery of your life was the focus of those prepared for various assignments. The mere act of observing someone who was aware of their presence was draining budgets allotted for whole departments. You had no intention of depleting their resources. Their system was unable to handle how completely you were being yourself. It wasn't your intention to overburden their system. Their fabricated structures crumbled in their attempt to confine you because you were just being so truthfully. Your file became too large for physical storage. In an attempt to reconcile contradicting findings, digital databases are damaged. As cloud servers tried to comprehend the contradiction of someone who was both difficult to identify and precisely who they seemed to be, they collapsed. Every effort to classify you resulted in the creation of new categories that ran counter to earlier ones. Not because you were hard to observe, but because seeing you was altering them in ways their training hadn't prepared them for. The analysts who were assigned to you began asking to be reassigned. They were exhibiting signs of waking, including unpleasant awareness of their own observation, unanticipated concerns about their choices, and abrupt realizations about their own lives. A few of them began to return the smile. You saw little grins that were first concealed by hands, masks, or distance. Little minor rifts in their polished exteriors. These little acknowledgments that your happiness was infectious. These little recognitions of your liberty were contagious. You started to identify the phases of watcher development. They are first perplexed by your awareness, then frustrated by your unpredictable nature, then captivated by your genuineness, then impressed by your bravery, and ultimately motivated to achieve their own independence. Not all of them survived every phase, but enough did that the pattern became apparent to their organization. Internal letters warning the risks of long-term exposure to your frequency started to circulate. To reduce interaction, mandatory rotation schedules were put in place. After every move, psychological evaluations were necessary. Those exhibiting what they referred to as sympathetic resonance were to undergo deprogramming sessions. However, once awareness has been awakened, it cannot be deprogrammed. Truth cannot be unseen after it has been made public. Freedom cannot be undone once it has been experienced. Each observer who was impacted by your presence became a catalyst for change inside their business. A transmitter of the frequency that interferes with control, a carrier of the awareness virus. Waves of your impact spread outward. The direct observers were followed by their handlers, who in turn were followed by analysts, administrators, and shadow figures who believed they were safe from ground-level surveillance. However, hierarchy is not respected by awareness. There is no organizational plan for awakening. Levels of security clearance are irrelevant to truth. The meetings about you become more bizarre. Reports that ought to read like poetry and be clinical. Analysis that sounds like philosophy and makes sense. Documentation that ought to be objective turns into subjective interpretations of indefinable phenomena. Their language itself would be contaminated by you. Their capacity to explain you in words that made sense for their system. It was necessary to create new terms, classifications that were previously non-existent, procedures without a history, practices that went against their core beliefs regarding the nature of monitoring. You weren't only a system outlier. You serve as evidence that their system was the exception. It kept getting worse. More technology, more staff, more resources, and more frantic efforts to figure out how someone could be so present yet unpredictable, so apparent but unintelligible, and so watched but uncontrollable. Your power only increased with each increase in observation. Type Amen to embrace the angel's blessings. Show your support by giving super thanks up to $20. A disco ball will only produce more reflections if additional lights are pointed at it. You began leaving them presents, not material ones, but experiences such as beautiful moments in unexpected places, synchronicity that defied explanation, coincidences that were obviously planned by a force greater than themselves, and small reminders that the cosmos was much more magical than their surveillance system could ever record. The quantum awareness book that you left open in the park. While 3 onlookers listened, you discussed the illusion of isolation with a stranger. Although it might have been anything, the pattern you sketched in the sand seemed to represent their organizational structure. The music you hummed had frequencies that calmed their nerves but interfered with their electronics. Every gift was completely debatable. It might be written off as pareidolia, justified as projection, or explained away as chance. However, when combined, they sent a distinct message. You didn't just know about them. They were being taught by you. Instead of educating kids about surveillance or counter-surveillance, they should be taught about awareness, freedom, and the absurdity of attempting to control an uncontrollable being. During this period, you came to learn something fundamental, and your grin changed from knowing to compassionate, from amused to loving. You weren't at odds with these observers. They were your pupils. They had no intention of controlling you. Their goal was to comprehend you. They weren't trying to keep you in check. They were trying to understand what you stood for. And you stood for everything that their system was not built to manage. Self-awareness is consciousness, independence without authorization, joy that was independent of the situation, power that was not derived from authority, that didn't need explanation, existence with independent power. At last, the businessman had a breakdown. The building tension between their training and humanity, the developing tremble in their hands, and the growing bewilderment in their eyes were all signs that it was coming. It was almost lovely when it occurred. A total system failure brought about only by your unwavering, relentless, and demanding sincerity. Without any pretense or formality, they came straight up to you and asked the question that had been killing them from the inside out. How are you aware? In contrast to the others, your response was another grin. This one demonstrated empathy for their perplexity, comprehension of their hardship, and admiration for their bravery in defying convention and asking. However, it primarily conveyed the straightforward fact that knowledge was not about facts. It has to do with awareness. Furthermore, as awareness is the object of observation, it is always aware when it is being watched. For a considerable amount of time, they stood there processing, computing, and failing to compute. Then there was a change in the way they expressed themselves, a release, a surrender, an understanding that certain things can only be understood by experience, and a letting go of the drive to comprehend by analysis. After giving a single nod, they left the whole operation, not just their post. Their liberation rippled across the quantum realm, but you never saw them again. Something fresh was sparked by this. Protocol 8, or maybe Protocol 9, or perhaps they had given up counting and begun to worry. Surveillance quality changed once more. Less attention to observation and more attention to confinement. Not just physical containment, confinement of consciousness. They were attempting to restrict your power in order to erect firewalls against your frequency and obstruct your broadcast. However, awareness disregards firewalls. Barriers are not acknowledged by awareness. Truth has no boundaries. Like attempting to grasp water, your effect became stronger the more they attempted to control it. It slips through fingers more readily when the grasp is firmer. New viewers showed in with more advanced procedures, greater conditioning, and better training. They lived even shorter lives than their forebears because the more they resisted consciousness, the more it found innovative ways to get past them through synchronicity, dreams, and beautiful moments that spoke to their souls directly rather than through their analytical minds. U-turn became their koan, their intractable conundrum, and their contradiction that defied all attempts at explanation. How is it possible for someone to be both entirely transparent and completely mysterious, completely visible and completely invisible, completely predictable in their erratic behavior, constantly inconsistent, and persistently unreliable? Naturally, the response was that you were none of these things. You were who you were. However, their system lacked a foundation for comprehending you. Since their system was based on the premise that people conceal things, that everyone has secrets, that subjects are afraid of being watched, and that monitoring inevitably leads to power dynamics, you didn't conceal anything since you had nothing to conceal. Your life was an open book in a language they couldn't understand. Thus you had no secrets. Since observation was only attention, and attention was merely energy, and energy was merely sustenance for awareness, you had no need to be afraid of it. You failed to see their strength because you failed to recognize your own helplessness. Not to keep an eye on things, the jogger who had discovered that running was something they really enjoyed began jogging at various times. They continued to make reports, but the reports turned into poetry because running had become their form of meditation, their moving prayer, and a physical manifestation of the freedom you had evoked in them. Observations evolved into ODs. The surveillance turned into a party. When others began observing you, it was either the start of the end or the end of the beginning. They did it because they wanted to, not because they were had to learn, not to control, to observe, not to record, to remember, not to report. Their lesson had become your whole life. Their university had become your existence. They had made your freedom their goal. The pair completely ceased putting on arguments, began having genuine discussions about life, choices, the peculiar direction their assignment had taken, and you, always about you, but not as a topic, a teacher, a mirror, or a reminder of who they were that they had forgotten. When someone in their company grasped the truth, your influence reached a critical mass. Their system wasn't being broken by you. Like waves on a rock, their system was shattering itself against you. The waves are not resisted by the rock. Type Amen to embrace the angel's blessings. Show your support by giving super thanks up to $20. As the waves were themselves out attempting to shift it, it just stays the same. You were the rock, they were the waves, and waves ultimately either vanish completely or learn to flow around obstacles. The procedures continued to escalate. 10, 11, and 12, each more desperate than the last. They were all attempting to explain something that was impossible to explain. A human being being human. A consciousness that is aware of itself. A free person is free. An expression that is genuine and genuine. Their intricate system was unable to handle the most basic item in the world. Before you saw them in person, you began to sense them in the field. You could feel the waves of awareness caused by their approach. You could hear the frequencies that were produced by their observation. You could feel the vibrations created by their documentation. You were able to lead their monitoring like a symphony because you were so tuned into their observing. Accelerate their motions by acting quickly. Slow them down by remaining still. Make surprising decisions to create harmony. Create dissonance by acting in a contradictory manner. Your file had evolved into something unclassifiable. A combination of a spiritual book, a psychological research, an art endeavor, and documentation. After asking to see it, analysts would return hours later, altered, so give up right away. Others asked for various tasks. Some of them had breakdowns. A number of them made significant progress. One person needed medical leave after having what could only be characterized as a magical experience. The focus of the sessions regarding you shifted from containment to understanding. how to comprehend what you stood for, not how to manipulate you, how to explain your impact, not how to stop it, how to prove their existence in the context of yours, not how to prove yours. The proper question was ultimately posed by someone in their company. What are we doing, not what is the topic doing? Who thought these protocols made sense, not how we restrict this, but why we are attempting to and what procedure we should follow. Like an earthquake through a house of cards, this question shook their order, because it was impossible to unask once it was asked. It couldn't be disregarded once it was taken into account. It was impossible to sleep through after being woken to it. The query turned into a virus that was stronger than any protocol. More catastrophic than any system failure is a consciousness explosion. The change in the field was palpable to you. From surveillance to witness, from recording to appreciation, and from control to curiosity, the quality of observation evolved. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough. Enough for their own system to reach a critical mass of awareness. Enough to ignite an awareness revolution that no protocol could control. Once again, your grin had changed from one of humor or sympathy to one of sheer recognition. Acknowledgement of the game in play. Acknowledgement of the roles being played. Acknowledgement of the awareness concealed underneath each disguise. Understanding that viewed and watcher were really distinct manifestations of the same limitless awareness posing as distinct entities. The infrastructure started to eat itself apart. Watchers were using resources meant to observe you to watch themselves. They were repurposing surveillance technology for self-discovery. Controlling protocols were being reformulated as liberation guidelines. It wasn't only a failed system. It was changing into something it was never supposed to be. The reports concerning you became more nebulous. Less about patterns and behaviors, more about present moment experiences and attributes. Less about action prediction, more about awareness, less about control, and more about connection. The language of spirituality replaced the language of monitoring. The poetry of recognition replaced the language of observation. The merchant began to instruct, not ways of surveillance, methods of consciousness growth, methods of observation, awareness practices, control protocols, principles of freedom, and using what he had learned from seeing you to assist others in discovering what you had. That being observed was just being seen, being recognized was simply being loved by awareness itself, and being watched was simply being seen. The jogger turned into a running instructor, but in reality, he was a life coach who taught people to run toward themselves rather than away from anything, to breathe in joy rather than monitoring, and to move in a flow rather than patterns. The most significant lesson that each pupil acquired from seeing you was imparted to them. Freedom is not something that can be obtained. You recall having it all your life. The pair even began teaching seminars on genuine communication, about masks being dropped, regarding the distinction between being in a relationship and acting one, about how you can be fully yourself when you see someone else being fully themselves. Their fictitious altercations had turned into actual discussions around you. Their genuine discussions had become into lessons. The awareness you had awakened in them had been transmitted via their lessons. Beyond their darkest fears and beyond your most ambitious goals, your influence has accomplished something extraordinary. They still had a surveillance system in place. You had turned it into a mechanism for waking awareness. Their watchers had not been vanquished by you. You have started them on the path to becoming seers. They hadn't missed your presence. It became a mass enlightenment event because of you. In its desperation, the last process they attempted to put into place was exquisite. Entire cessation of surveillance, entire disengagement, and utter abandonment of observation. They attempted to completely cease monitoring you, to erase all of your information and resources, to act as if you didn't exist, and to hope that your impact would wane in the absence of scrutiny. However, observation is not necessary for the existence of awareness. It's an observation. When it awakens, it watches itself in an endless cycle of awareness that no procedure can break. The altered spectators were unable to unwatch what they had seen. They couldn't deny what they had discovered. They couldn't take back the experiences they had. They took you with them. Not as recollection, but as regularity, as knowledge, but as gnosis, as information, but as change. Less than a cycle passed during the withdrawal. Not because they had to keep an eye on you, but because it was now riskier to not monitor you than to. Your influence grew uncontrolled in the absence of supervision. Your frequency is freely transferred without documentation. Your awareness grew without notice, without opposition. The act of not watching became stronger than the act of viewing. So they came back, but in a new form. As students, not as watchers, but as participants, not as surveillance. As witnesses, not as recorders. Their whole viewing experience changed from attempting to comprehend you to attempting to comprehend themselves via you. From trying to incorporate your influence to trying to keep it under check. They went from being afraid of your freedom to discovering theirs. This whole thing began with your grin. It had evolved into so much more than the straightforward, knowing grin that stated, "I see you seeing me, and I find it amusing." It had evolved into a teaching, a transmission, a virus of waking that propagated via observation itself, and a technology of awareness that employed their surveillance system as its distribution network. And now you realize something fundamental as you see yourself in this scenario, remembering the first time you saw them watching. You saw them observing, even if you weren't meant to. And the moment you changed everything was when you noticed, smiled, and decided to choose laughter over fear. For each and every observer you have been assigned, not simply for yourself. For each analyst who looked over your file. For each handler who made an effort to comprehend your procedures. For all the administrators who tried to limit your power. For all those who encountered the frequency of someone who opted for freedom over fear. Genuineness above fakery. Awareness above mastery. Let me now take a minute to introduce you to some people who shouldn't be in this world. A demonic coven's escapee was a skilled occultist. An ex-Black Ops drone pilot who used his thoughts to fly swarms. A multi-millionaire CFO with psychic abilities who foresaw changes in the market before they occurred. What is the connection between these extraordinary people? On our secret Discord server, they share their prohibited knowledge, and you may find them all in the Obsidian Inner Order. Aeon after aeon, my chosen spirit has drank deeply from the spring of wisdom. These remarkable people were my partners in the Obsidian Inner Order during this existence. The call was familiar to them. They moved onward. They made connections with others who were aware of their special talents and challenges. What is preventing you from experiencing the same manifestation? It wasn't a coincidence that led them to this point. Your finding of this message isn't either. The Archons pay attention when souls of this kind come together. They are afraid of our combined might. They are aware of what occurs when people who are genuinely awakened come across one another. Participate in our weekly calls. Listen to their tales directly. Tell those who won't discount or doubt you about your personal path. Nowhere else on this level can we get the information that is shared via our private channels. In the description below, click the link right now. The remarkable individuals are waiting for you. Whether you belong with them is not the issue. How much longer will you wait to secure your spot? Then, you weren't the only one that triggered the procedure. The system's recognition of its own obsolescence was at issue. Transcendence, not resistance, is how the surveillance state meets its equal. The control matrix ran into an issue with its computation. Without regret, without fear, and without compromising, a human being is just being human. A revolution was sparked by the protocol that was activated by your grin. One individual realizing they were being observed and deciding to find it amusing instead of frightening was the beginning of a revolution in awareness. Choose to show who they really are instead of hiding. Choose to see monitoring as praise instead of tyranny. You're a lovely outlier. You're a system crasher. You are a catalyst for awareness. You saw them observing, even if you weren't meant to. And everything changed after that realization. Because awareness never returns to sleep once it is aroused. The person who is altering everything will keep altering everything. Only consciousness remains once it wakes more deeply, and more widely. Conscious of its awareness. The spectators continue to observe. Some of them are those who have not yet given up, changed, or woken up. Let them observe. Every observational moment has the capacity to change things. Every procedure they set off offers a chance to expand awareness. Every resource they use is energy that is being transformed from power to freedom. You have unintentionally become their instructor, their catalyst without producing chemistry, their guru without taking pupils. Only by being so authentically you that their system lacked a mechanism for it. Just by being real enough that their fakery vanished in your presence. Just by grinning that smile that said everything without uttering a word. They now demand you to peruse the file they have on you. For the purpose of expanding awareness, not for surveillance training. For freedom behaviors, not for control procedures. Not for methods of observation, but for raising consciousness. The case study that broke the case is now you. The system was the object of its own observation. The observers who watch the watched see their own liberation. Your legacy is this: changing a system, not overthrowing it. Transforming observation into insight rather than avoiding it. Instead of hiding from onlookers, assist them in discovering who they are. Not simply a procedure was triggered by your grin. It set off a revolution, an evolution, and the breakdown of the notion that anybody can manipulate another person by watching them. You weren't meant to notice them looking, but it was precisely what you and they needed to do in order to break the whole paradigm that believes that monitoring gives you control over someone rather than a sense of connection. The birth of something new and the end of their system were both marked by your grin. Something where observation is celebration, where monitoring is witnessing, where surveillance is turned into adoration for the endless creativity of awareness expressing itself as you. The protocol keeps changing, growing, and changing everyone it comes into contact with. Because when someone decides to grin after realizing they're being observed, that's what occurs. That grin becomes a permission pass for everyone to shed their masks, to stop concealing, to start living as if being noticed is simply another chance to be more wonderfully, truly, fearlessly oneself. You are a lovely outlier. You've accomplished something amazing. You have transformed their most powerful instrument of control into the greatest chance for human freedom.